into the airport today here in Los Angeles. Okay, everybody was commenting that in this long line, everybody was so polite. Everybody was so kind.
Well, let me. I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me, if I may.
So phenomenal. Sure, you may.
Thank you, sir. One religious leader said this yesterday, and I just want just react to it. Okay, here's the quote. It's from Jerry Falwell. I really believe that, he's talking about why this happened. He said, I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, the People for American Way, all of them who have tried to secularize America, I'd point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen. That's what he said. What do you say?
Oh, I don't want to interpret his comments. I can't relate to it in a spirit that would probably do justice, and I probably would have to. I'm not going there. I'm going to go to Jesus Christ because I'm a follower of Christ. And what's so shocking to me is that not only the Muslims, but many of my Jewish friends respect Jesus Christ. And if we see the God of love in him, let's focus on that. I do believe that our country is going to become strong as we come back to God and back to morality. I do think this is going to impact our culture. I think that it's going to impact the depravity that is in the culture, and that's, I think, that what Jerry was pointing to. But let's be positive. Let's come back to a faith that is positive and loving and caring, so that this caring compassion that we see all over America and in the world today. I have a global telecast, as you probably know, and I've been getting telephone calls from Holland. They're weeping on the telephone for us. And in Germany and in the Orient, the world is weeping tonight. And only people who have the capacity to love will weep the way they're weeping. And the world is sad. Yes.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I thought you'd finished. I thought you'd finished. I apologize.
You've got to cut me off. I'm a preacher.
Well, then I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it very carefully and very gently, if you don't mind. Thank you for joining us. You can't fault me for trying to draw you into this discussion with Reverend Falwell. I gave it my best effort. It's nice to talk to you, sir.
Thank you.
Robert Schuller joined us from Los Angeles with his thoughts on how we might look at this theologically. We want, as we just clear the top of the hour, 2 minutes past the hour, update you on some of the latest developments. And first among them, the cockpit voice recorder, one of the black boxes on the plane that crashed in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, has now been found. That's the voice recorder, and it has now been found. You might recall that that's the plane where it is speculated, at least, that the pilots, or the passengers rather, tried to overpower the hijackers, and it is possible we may learn something about why that plane went down from that black box. That's just coming in. Also late tonight, the Pentagon revised downward the number of people presumed dead in the crash at the Pentagon, down from 190 to 189. Anti-drop is good news. One person had been counted twice, as it turns out. Meanwhile, sources at the Pentagon tell us at least 4 Air Force fighter jets scrambled to intercept the hijacked passenger planes in the skies on Tuesday, of course, all arriving too late. And details are emerging about the first arrest stemming from the attacks. The Justice Department says the possible material witness was one of the people detained at Kennedy Airport yesterday has been arrested. More on that from our Justice Department correspondent, Kelly Arena. Kelly.
Aaron, 2 men in INS custody in Texas are being transported to New York City tonight for further questioning in the investigation of the terrorist incidents. Now, government sources say the 2 have been very helpful in moving the investigation forward, and they have detailed knowledge of the terrorist network. The men were taken into custody on Wednesday as they were traveling on an Amtrak train. The 2 had been traveling without legal identification and carrying box cutters. Now, that is the same type of weapon that the FBI says was used by some of the hijackers. Now, it has been reported that the pair was traveling on Tuesday on a flight from Newark bound for San Antonio when the plane was grounded in St. Louis due to the hijackings. The men later got on a train bound for San Antonio. Now, that train was stopped on Wednesday by police request, and the pair was pulled off. Now, this development follows another in New York that we told you about earlier, where the first arrest has been made in direct connection to Tuesday's terrorist attacks. An individual who was detained at JFK Airport in New York is in custody on a material witness warrant. Now, what that is that a material witness warrant is only issued when it can be demonstrated that there's information that is highly relevant to a criminal investigation and when there's a risk of flight. Law enforcement sources say to expect similar arrests in coming days. So very quickly, Aaron, we are seeing this investigation move forward.
Kelly, thanks. It does seem to be moving forward very quickly. All of this does, just in the hour that we've been on the air tonight. A number of things that have happened, including that. Thank you for your work again. Can we help me on this, guys? Has the House vote? The House is okay. The Senate earlier today voted on a use of force resolution, and there were no dissenting votes in the Senate. In the House tonight, the House has just now finished that vote, and we see one no vote, or that column that says NV is non-voting or not voting. 388 yes on the use of force resolution. It's kind of a complicated technical legal document, and one vote against, and we'll try one Democrat. We know it's a Democrat. We don't yet know who. We'll figure that out in a moment or so, but that vote is now complete, and the president has the authorization he was seeking to essentially go after the people he believes are responsible for this and those who may have harbored them. That is very much shorthand for what that resolution allows the president to do. That vote just finishing up in the House now. Now, we take a break. That is to say, we take a break and turn things over to our colleague, Jeff Greenfield, our senior analyst who joins us here in New York with a number of guests and a number of conversations. Jeff.
Thank you, Aaron. Three things have been said almost from the moment that those towers went up. First, that America has changed forever. Second, that this is not the end of terrorist attacks. And third, that the only way to stop these attacks is to root out not only the terrorists, but the states that support them. We're going to be talking about that with three guests very knowledgeable in these fields. Judith Miller is an investigative reporter for the New York Times. She has written, among other things, about the world of Islam. Her most recent book, co-authored with two other New York Times reporters, is about germ warfare. Also with me in New York is Zev Chafetz. He is a columnist for the New York Daily News. He was for 30 years a resident of Israel and served for 5 years as director of the government press office in the prime ministership of Menachem Begin. Also in Washington with us is L. Paul Bremer. He served as ambassador at large for counterterrorism in the Reagan administration. He chaired what was the National Commission on Terrorism. He's now a senior advisor on politics and emerging risk for Marsh McLennan Incorporated. Mr. Bremer, I understand, just as a dark footnote, that many of your colleagues in that company are as yet unaccounted for. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. We are still missing many hundreds of our employees.
Well, words can't express what we feel about that, but let me turn to the larger issues, if I might. You wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal in which you said we must punish not just the terrorists, but any group or state that in any way supported them. I'd like to put some meat on the bones of that, if I might. Say the Taliban is protecting bin Laden and say he is found responsible for what happened. Pakistan provides assistance to the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. China just signed an economic and development deal with the Taliban. How far do you mean that statement to go when you say we must punish any state that in any way supports the terrorists?
Well, I think in the case you give, we obviously would include the Taliban, and that's the primary target. Pakistan is in a difficult position, and if we understand what has been announced this afternoon, the Pakistanis have decided to join us in the campaign, whatever it's going to be, to root out terrorism in Afghanistan. With the Chinese, it seems to me, our position should be that we want them to cut off all relations with the Taliban at a minimum and to join us in our efforts to destroy terrorism in Afghanistan.
But by punishment, in the case of, let's say, China does not do what you suggest, you are not, I take it, suggesting military action, but rather economic sanctions, other punishment short of force?
Look, the United States is going to have a strategy that operates on three different levels. There's the immediate level of what to do about bin Laden and the Taliban. There is another ring around that, which is the level where you go after, actively go after people who are actively supporting terrorists. I have in mind countries like Iran, Iraq, and particularly Syria, which still gives succor and safe haven to terrorists. And then you have outside that a broader ring, which is to try to build an international consensus that says terrorism is unacceptable. And the Chinese, in the case you posit, are in the third ring here. We want them to say it's no longer acceptable to have those kinds of relations with a government like that of the Taliban.
The question about Afghanistan, an Afghani writer living in San Francisco wrote an interesting column. He describes himself as somebody who hates the Taliban, hates Osama bin Laden. He suggests the Taliban, in effect, are an occupying hostile force in Afghanistan, that the people do not support them, that bombing will not work against a country that has successfully resisted everybody from the Brits to the Russians or the Soviets, and that the only way to really get him is to actually land ground forces in Afghanistan and wage a protracted war. Are you in agreement that that may have to happen if the United States is to do what you want?
I'm afraid I am in agreement. I think that is probably what is going to happen. It is true that the Taliban are not universally loved. They are all Pathans. The Pathans make up less than half the population in Afghanistan, and they're certainly not loved by the other tribes, particularly the tribes north of the Hindu Kush Mountains. So there is something to work with within Afghanistan, but it's not going to be enough to get rid of the Taliban. We're going to have to probably do that ourselves.
All right. Let me turn for a few minutes to Judith Miller. First, is there any doubt in your mind that what happened Tuesday is the work of Osama bin Laden? And can we say that, do you think, with some certainty?
Well, I think the administration, Jeff, has kind of said that. And beyond that, you know, since I'm not an intelligence agency, I think that certainly corresponded to my gut feeling about this.
Fair enough. So let me move on. One of the things that has been said again and again and again is this was a failure of intelligence, particularly the failure to use what is called human intelligence. We relied too much on electronic intercepts, relied too much on satellites. We needed people to infiltrate Osama bin Laden and his cohorts. On a difficulty scale of 1 to 10, how hard would that have been for us to have done that?
Oh, I think about a 9.5. I mean, it's Jerry knows this because he's lived and worked in Afghanistan in a previous life. But I have visited there, and this is extremely difficult country in which to work as a foreigner. And I think that what I saw from our Arab allies is that they were in a much better position to do that than American intelligence. I mean, blonde, blue-eyed American shows up and says, "Hi, I'm here with company X, Y, or Z, and I'm here to help you." And the Taliban immediately think, CIA. So this is not easy work.
But just to try to explore the complexity of this, if we were to turn to one of the moderate Arab states we consider allies, and ask them to go after Osama bin Laden, does that not put some risks on their shoulders, given the support for radical Islam in some of their own countries?
Well, I think it does, but I also think that the mood in those states has dramatically changed in the past 2 or 3 years.
How so?
Well, I think the Millennium bombing plot, the effort to ring in the new year in a, quote, Islamic way, that Osama bin Laden's networks attempted to stage, really galvanized a lot of American allies in the Middle East and showed them that if they didn't fight this kind of terror, they themselves would become the victims of it. I can only tell you that in previous articles that I've written, I worked very closely with some Middle Eastern intelligence officials who had rather good information about what Osama bin Laden was up to and his networks. And that information was enormously helpful in many cases to the Americans.
So the statement that we, the United States or the West, must root and branch terrorism and its supporters within the Arab world, within the Near East, within many other countries. I mean, it sounds as if what you're saying is, without the support of our Arab allies, without their wholehearted support, this is not this is a prescription that can't work.
I don't think you can do it without their wholehearted support, and that, in fact, is part of the problem. Wholehearted, because some of our Arab allies want to have things both ways. On one hand, they want to work with us quietly, secretly, against terrorism in their own countries and directed at the West. And on the other hand, they want to be, quote, on the right side of the street, the Arab street. That is, they want to identify with the causes that Osama bin Laden and people like him attempt to tap into.
So when you hear Pakistan, for instance, say, we're on your side, we utterly condemn this, we will help you, ought we to take that with a grain of salt?
I think we ought to be hopeful that they mean what they say, but once again, having worked there, Pakistan is a country whose secular government, they are even embarrassed about calling themselves that, but this is a government that is deeply torn. It is very full of factions and sympathizers with the Islamists. Their intelligence service is penetrated. It's going to be very hard for them to pull this off.
All right, let me turn now to Zoe Chaffetz, and I want to start with a specific subject about which you wrote, and that has to do with the issue of airline security in the United States. We've heard it probably 1,000 times said that, you know, that we now have to become, every American airline has to become El Al, which hasn't had a hijacking in 30 years. They rigorously search bags, they do interviews. Can we do that?
No, I don't think so.
Why not?
First of all, Israel has only one airport, has only one international airport, only one airline, only several airlines traveling in and out. America has thousands of airports. And besides that, El Al security is not a matter of technique, it's a matter of philosophy. It takes into account that there are potentially dangerous people getting on planes. And it treats people, passengers, as potential suspects. Or as potential danger, security danger.
Well, I don't see, yes.
That will,
we could do that.
At best, that will take hours and hours of preparatory time for flights. It will slow down the American economy. But beyond that, it's not really the issue, because America is a country with tens of thousands of targets. If terrorists find that, if there were security at airports, I mean real security, which would cost a fortune and which would take an enormous amount of effort, but if that were to happen, terrorists would go to the train station. They'd go to the nearest high school. They'd go to the ball game.
It does raise this issue of locking the barn door after the horse is gone. That is, I've seen all these stories of incredibly tightened security, American airports, curbside check-ins, and the like. And I have to admit, I thought to myself, yeah, but it's not likely that the next terrorist will do what the last one did.
Of course not. There, you know, right now there are buildings all over Manhattan and all over the East Coast and all over the country that are wide open. After the World Trade Center, there's no security in genuine terms.
So you're talking
here.
about somebody walking into Penn Station, which obviously has no
Or Grand
security.
Central, or any place. And you know, the issue is that you can't deal with terrorism. There are probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, Arabs, Muslims, who are prepared to carry out terrorist acts in this country. You can't deal with terrorism by picking them off one at a time. It's an impossibility.
And so instead,
you have to go to the source.
and the source is?
The source, first of all, are the countries that support terrorism, and they are Syria, Iran, and Iraq, and probably Iran and Iraq most importantly, and maybe Syria, because they have the potential to have nuclear weapons.
Zev, when you say we must go to them, what do you mean?
I mean that it's December 8th, 1941, and people are saying, what should we do about Japan? There are 100 million Japanese, there are 100 million Germans. How can we ever conquer these countries? It's impractical. We should fire a missile. We should go after the commander of the Japanese Navy. That's nonsense. America is going to have to go in, dismantle and disarm these insane governments, and the terrorists that they support, or the next attack on this city, or the one after, ask Judy, will be a biological or a nuclear attack, and it won't be 5,000 dead, it will be 500,000 dead.
Mr. Bremer, I think what Mr. Chaffetz is saying, in fact, I'm pretty sure of it, is we have to declare war on the states of Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Is that what we have to do?
Well, I hope not. As I said, I think the inner circle of the focus is going to be on Afghanistan, where I think we will be at war. I think there is something, however, he has said that's very true, which is 20 years ago, the United States government took the lead in developing an international consensus that the use and support of terrorism was no longer acceptable, and we did a pretty good job of building that consensus during the 80s. That has largely been lost during the 90s. And we've got to rebuild that consensus now. We've got to get serious about it when we say that we consider, for example, the countries he named, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. When we say they're terrorist-supporting states, then our policy has to follow that through to the consequences, and we have to insist that our allies agree. For example, our allies have been falling all over themselves to sign commercial agreements with Iran. In fact, we have also got the possibility of putting sanctions on those countries which have been waived by the previous administration and by this administration. Syria has the headquarters of a dozen terrorist groups, known terrorist groups who operate in the open in Damascus, terrorist groups which have killed Israeli and other citizens in just this past year. They operate freely in Damascus. Syria allows more than a dozen terrorist training camps to continue to operate in the Bekaa Valley, though it has been raised with them for more than 15 years. Those kinds of things have simply got to be stopped. And in the end, if they don't stop them, we may have to take military action. But it seems to me that's not the immediate concern now. The immediate concern now is to take some steps that show that we are really serious about terrorism, to take steps which broaden that beyond the immediate targets of Afghanistan and bin Laden, and to create this new international consensus.
Judy Miller, pick up on something that Zev alluded to, that the next time it's not going to be 5,000, but God knows how many. You just co-authored a book on germ warfare. Do you take, and there was a report, I should mention, in an Arab newspaper just yesterday that Osama bin Laden had trumpeted the fact that he says thousands of young supporters of his have studied chemical, biological, nuclear warfare, prepared to martyr themselves for it. Without getting into the assessment of that, do you take seriously the fact that we, the United States, are under potential threat for an attack in the chemical or biological field?
Well, if I didn't take that threat seriously, I wouldn't have written this book. I think that I started out, Jeff, very, very skeptically. I did not believe that biological weapons were a real threat to this country. I thought that all the people issuing these warnings were kind of looking for a new enemy. And the more I looked at the spread of this very dangerous technology and how relatively easy this was to do compared to the enormous expense and difficulty of a nuclear infrastructure that you need to make a weapon, the more of a no-brainer it seemed. And my colleagues and I concluded that this really was the 21st century weapon for what President Bush has called the 21st century wars.
Well, okay. When I stood on the roof here at CNN, 2 miles north of the World Trade Center with my colleague Aaron Brown, and looked at the smoke billowing across lower Manhattan, I will confess to you that one of my thoughts was, suppose they brought something with them on those planes. If that is the case, then is it too alarmist to say we may have to go in and declare war on every state that is harboring groups that have the potential and the willingness to use germ warfare against the West?
Well, you know, I think there are a lot of steps short of that the administration is going to start to take. But the first thing they can really do is make good on the previous administration's promise to, quote, drain the swamp. I mean, that was Mike Sheehan's great pledge. He was the former director of counterterrorism for the State Department, and he said what you have to do to get rid of these networks is drain the swamp in which they live. And under the Clinton administration, I have to say that some progress was made in eliminating the countries that play host to these groups. And now we have to concentrate on the rest of them.
Before I turn to the last question and get a comment from each of you, I want, Zev, for you to take us a little more personally into this issue. You lived in Israel for 30 years. It's a state that has never lived outside of conflict and threat. Do you get used to it? I mean, do you go out at night and put that thought behind you, or is it always with you?
You get used to it, but in the Israeli reality, you mentioned that I lived in Israel for 30 years. I served in the Army for close to 30 years, in the active Army and the reserve. So does everyone. We learn to be careful, and we learn that we have to be proactive. One of the things that is very hard for Americans to do is to stare evil in the face. And if you want to combat evil, if you want to fight Islamic and Arab terrorism, and I don't call them generically terrorism because we're talking about Islamic and Arab terrorism, you have to call them by their proper name. You have to put your finger on where they are. You have to go after them, and you have to finish the job.
But you've also were born in America and live here now. This is a country that is almost, in this sense, the mirror image of Israel, right, Judy? We've never lived with anything approaching threat, not even in World War II. Can a country like ours learn?
I can tell you that if we don't learn in this country, if America doesn't learn, there will be disastrous consequences. And I don't think America needs to learn. The governments, the armies of Iran and Iraq and Syria are not so formidable. Israel is a 5 million person state, and it's been fighting these morons successfully for 30, 40, 50 years.
But Zev, you still have suicide bombers, and you have more of them every day.
That's right.
So,
And
how is that a victory?
It's the victory. First of all, the victory is that Israel is there, and it's getting bigger and stronger, and richer and more free as time goes on. But the point is that we have to deal with reality, and now reality has showed up in Manhattan. The reality of the Arab and Islamic Middle East is here. You are, as we are, the enemy of these people. And they will do here what they've done in Israel. They will try to kill as many people as possible, and they will do it very efficiently.
Let me turn to the. But before I turn to you, Mr. Bremer, I just want to get from Judith Miller a reaction to that. Chaffetz says the only solution is to go in and dismantle these states.
I don't think that's possible. I mean, my own view, I don't think that it may be necessary. I think these states want ultimately not to be isolated. And if the rest of the world means what it says about joining America in this campaign, I think they will find themselves truly isolated, and that hopefully the use of military force will not be necessary. But Jeff, I want to say one more thing. I think it's very dangerous. We're on a very slippery slope here. The terrorists win if we become the enemy that we are fighting. If we live in fear, if we do violent things that kill innocent people, we become them, and they will gloat at this victory. So it's very difficult to fight on one hand and maintain our democratic values on the other.
Mr. Bremer, I want to bring you in and ask what I suppose is in one sense, the toughest question. How will we know when we've won? We knew how we won in Japan. They surrendered on a aircraft carrier. I remember, seeing those pictures in history. How will we know when we've won this war?
Well, first of all, fighting terrorism is more like fighting crime. Terrorism has been here since recorded history began, and it's always going to be here. So there is no final victory in the sense that terrorism is stamped out any more than you can stamp out crime. A legitimate goal for foreign policy is to get terrorism down to a point where it does not dominate our foreign policy, where we conduct our relations with other nations on other bases of political and diplomatic interchange, economic interchange, free trade, and so forth. But we need to be a bit realistic. We're not going to eliminate terrorism. It's always going to be there. There always will be vulnerabilities. And as Judy Miller said, the real challenge for a country like America, the great strength of America, is an ability to wage this kind of a war while protecting our civil liberties that we have fought and died for over 200 years, and to keep those in balance with the measures we're now going to have to take, security measures we're now going to have to take. I think we can do that. We've done it before. We are a great and resilient nation, and we will come through this.
But let me just pursue this analogy, false though it may be. When we defeated Japan and Germany, we killed countless hundreds of thousands of their civilians as well as military people. We occupied their capitals. And within a relatively short amount of time, Germany and Japan became functioning, healthy democracies allied with the West. There's no chance. Is there any chance that that could possibly happen with states like Iran, Iraq, and Syria? I mean, even if it were militarily possible?
Well, I don't think you can generalize. I think Iran is already a democracy. They have elections there. You can't say the same thing about Iraq, and Syria has basically phony elections. So you've got to look at each of them individually in terms of their culture and their history and their background. I'm not advocating. I share Judy's concern. I'm not advocating that we go to war with everybody who's in the neighborhood. I think if we act vigorously in the narrow case of Afghanistan and the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, we will find that we can change the whole dynamic of the region, where people will begin to respect that we are really serious, we really mean business, and if we can get our allies to stand with us, we'll find that we can get a lot of things done without having to use force in the second ring, that is, that I described, where we go after these other countries.
So, Chaffetz, you were shaking your head when Mr. Bremer was offering that. I'm assuming that you don't agree with that assessment.
No, I don't agree. I think that going into Afghanistan is exactly the wrong thing to do. Afghanistan is a sideshow. It's a remarkably difficult country to accomplish anything in. And it's a country which doesn't, aside from providing safe haven for the Taliban, for bin Laden, doesn't really pose a major threat in itself. The real threats, America needs to go after the real threats. It can't pretend, I mean, it's been convenient up until now to play all sorts of games about what's dangerous and what isn't. The World Trade Center ought to tell everybody that it is too dangerous to allow rogue nations, whether it's Iran or Iraq or Syria or perhaps Libya or others, to have weapons of mass destruction, because they will be used not just by terrorists whom they harbor, but by the governments themselves.
And just to pursue this, because we're down to the last couple of minutes, if we go to war with Iran, Iraq, Syria, maybe Libya, what is to prevent? It seems to me if there's one thing that will guarantee a terrorist with the capability to unleash germ warfare to do it, it's that. So do we win under those circumstances?
The beginning of wisdom in this conflict is to put aside past conceptions and to understand that there's no need to be so pessimistic. If America could defeat Germany and Japan, it can defeat Syria and Iran. And if the Iranians and the Syrians or the Iraqis have weapons, better that whatever happens now and not 3 years from now.
Judith Miller, I want to give you the last word, because you were shaking your head when Zev was. At least we didn't book a panel where everyone was in agreement. So I'm going to ask you to cap this by answering the question that I asked Mr. Bremer. How will we know when we've won? What does it mean to win?
I think I have to agree with Jerry Bremer that it's we'll never be able to just declare victory, but I think you will see that there will be no more attacks like the attacks we've seen. And you know, nobody's a soothsayer. We cannot determine how this long struggle will come out, but I do know that it's going to be, I think it's going to be a very long struggle indeed.
Tough conversation for a Friday night, but this has not been the usual week we have been used to. Thanks very much to my guest, Judith Miller of the New York Times, Zev Chaffetz of the New York Daily News, and in Washington, L. Paul Bremer, former ambassador at large for counterterrorism in the Reagan administration. And Mr. Bremer, we hope that the miracle can happen with your colleagues. Thank you all for joining us. Aaron Brown, back to you.
Jeff, thank you very much. The bottom of the hour now. Let's take a look quickly at some of the latest developments for those of you who may just be joining us. Some things have changed along the way as well. Searchers have found the cockpit voice recorder from the hijacked plane that crashed in Pennsylvania on Tuesday. Much information is possible there. Rescuers trying to reach the World Trade Center through a train tunnel that goes under the Hudson River from New Jersey were thwarted tonight when they found that the last 500 feet was flooded to the ceiling. They were hoping that there might be some survivors in the train or in the tunnels on those lower levels, but that is not to be. Two men said to have detailed knowledge of the terrorist network are taken to New York from Texas tonight. They were taken from an Amtrak train. They were armed with box cutters and without legal ID. And late tonight, the House of Representatives followed the Senate in passing a use of force resolution. It is a resolution that gives the president a green light to use military force to go after the terrorists, the masterminds, and those countries the president believes harbors them. One dissenting vote there. And observances of a National Day of Prayer and Remembrance continue tonight. Earlier, many of the giant marquees along the Las Vegas Strip went dark in tribute to the victims of Tuesday's attack. I want to show you a couple things here. I'm sorry, they're just getting organized a bit. These are pictures we just got of the excuse me, Ground Zero area. This was shot by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. today. And you see the rescue workers moving in. I think as we get a little, there we go, we get a much better sense of two things, it seems to me: the extent of the damage and the broadness of the damage as well. And you also get a sense of the people who are working there, the fatigue on their faces and the rest. These are pictures that were shot, as we say, by FEMA, as FEMA officials toured the area today. They came in around the time the president came in. Now a series of still pictures. This is in the moments after the first plane hit the first tower on Tuesday. These were taken in tower number 1. As you see people coming down the stairwell trying to get out. Look at on the right side, the woman's face, if you can see it. I think is there one more in this sequence, David? Okay, let's take a look. Again, these were shot shortly after the plane hit on Tuesday in the first of the towers at the World Trade Center. We have, I think, 3 or 4 more of those pictures at our website. You can go to our website at CNN.com. Try and help make people through this time of grief. As you know, Americans today all over the country really came together, big cities, small cities, for a National Day of Prayer and Remembrance. National correspondent Bruce Morton takes a look at all that was said and heard there.
Church services everywhere. America's leadership was at Washington's National Cathedral, but services everywhere. Cleveland, Ohio.
We mourn for the many lives lost in a tragedy that remains etched in our minds forever.
Boston, Massachusetts.
Look with compassion on the whole human family, and especially on those who lost their lives this week.
Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer.
At the Pentagon, where many lost fellow workers and friends.
May God comfort all of you that are in loss today, and may we wait on Him and renew our strength.
Manchester, New Hampshire. An Islamic service in Sterling, Virginia, near Dulles Airport.
When people accuse you of being terrorist, this is because this is what they were told.
Austin, Texas.
Banish the violence that has been in our midst and the evil that exists around us.
Back at Washington's National Cathedral, the Commander-in-Chief.
This conflict was begun on the timing and terms of others. It will end in a way and at an hour of our choosing.
That service ended with a hymn, a battle hymn. Bruce Morton, CNN, Washington.
This tragedy has been, we suspect, especially difficult for the many millions of Arab Americans in the country. There has been a considerable amount of harassment of them. It's a very difficult time. They, too, in many places in the country, gathered to pray in this National Day of Mourning and Remembrance. CNN's Richard Blystone on the New York Muslim community now.
A community rich in immigrants, sharing the time-honored aim of making it in America. Still on good terms with their old cultures. Still strong in their faith, Islam. Atlantic Avenue, they proudly say, is the oldest Arab community in New York, and as stunned as anyone by Tuesday's carnage.
It's shocking, it's horrible, you feel very bad, you know.
What's different here is fear of taking the blame.
All Arab American and Muslims in this country that resides and live and make their living in this country are as good as American as anyone else that came from all over the world, and they love the American flag just like anyone else, and they have nothing to do against this country, and this is one of the reasons we are living in this country.
Nonetheless, Atlantic Avenue today is keeping a low profile, lest the rash of slurs and slights and insults get more serious. Ahmed Morsi is passing out a letter in Arabic from the New York District Attorney, telling Arabs and Muslims where to call if harassed or attacked, like his own mother on Tuesday.
She was spit at, go back to your country, die, this and all these different slurs and different, my mother.
Islam is a religion of tolerance, says the Imam Abdul Rahman Tafa, a religion that forbids ignorant wars between nations. Muslims from 22 nations come to pray here. We all feel the pain of what happened, says the Imam, and he asks, please give blood, money, whatever you can to help victims of the disaster. But if the attackers were Muslims pursuing what they saw as a holy war, did Islam attack America? Jihad is for defense and defense only, he says, and anyone who preaches otherwise doesn't know Islam. The Quran says if a man murders another human being, it is as though he killed all humanity. This Friday service ends with special prayers for all those who were killed, including at least 50 Muslims. Richard Blystone, CNN, Brooklyn, New York.
One of the things that seems to be binding all Americans these days, no matter their backgrounds in the aftermath of this tragedy, is a renewed sense of patriotism. We came across a statistic today that just since Tuesday, Kmart and Walmart, these two giant retailers, have sold about 500,000 American flags. Obviously, many other flags have been sold as well. It would seem that many people feel that there is no other place to turn, that the flag is the one thing that connects them all and makes them feel a little bit better in a very difficult time. Here's CNN's Ann McDermott.
You might take this guy for a loony in better days, but these are days of rage.
Our people, this is our people, this is our land, this is our way of life.
And the people below are with him. And in a way, so is Arthur Jagle, who heard and saw things this week he could not take in.
They were unbelievable. I thought that it was just a dream, but it wasn't.
He is glad to know, though, that others are doing what he's doing this day, flying their flags. When they can find them, this man wanted a big one.
Well, unfortunately, it's all they have left.
But Rose Tibbs didn't care what kind of flag she got. Too sad to care.
You know, it breaks your heart. It breaks your heart to think that people have so much anger and hate in their hearts that they could do something like this.
She took her flags back to work, handed them out to her office mates, and then they watched TV. A prayer service was on. People seem to want prayer these days, hoping perhaps that God will shed his grace on them. But America, meanwhile, is opening up its heart and wallet. These radio stations collected more than $100,000 for victim relief in just a couple of hours. And here, too, they show the colors. Something that perhaps seems trivial against a backdrop of so much suffering. But for Michael Maranga, it says what he feels.
We're here, and we're not going away.
Ann McDermott, CNN, Los Angeles.
This week that has been like no other is going to lead to a weekend that is going to be anything but usual as well. There are going to be no Major League Baseball games. All Major League Baseball games have been canceled through the weekend. The National Football League has canceled its games as well, so no games, no football on Sunday. And there will be only a few college games as well. The Emmy Awards were scheduled for Sunday. They've been moved to next month. And the release of a number of movies has also been postponed for the weekend because they're pretty violent, and that seemed pretty inappropriate given all the violence that we've seen. CNN's Beth Nissen now on what New Yorkers are doing to try and escape this tragedy.
For most New Yorkers, it doesn't seem much like the start of a weekend. Still, in a week when so many people who went to work on Tuesday never came home, it was good to see the work week end. Many headed out of town for hastily arranged family gatherings. Jason Spiewak was taking Amtrak to his parents' home in Pennsylvania.
I've just been stirred up all week by the goings on, and I just want to be close to family and friends.
Bree McCallop was going home to Florida.
I live by myself, and I really just don't want to be here right now. I just don't feel comfortable being here. I don't feel safe.
Almost everyone understood the desire to get away from the unrelenting anguish and distress and fear, to read about and think about something else, anything else.
You'd almost want the new fall season on TV because, it's an escape. Everywhere you look is just inundated with the pictures that you've seen over and over and over, and it's 24/7. And you have to switch to something like Cartoon Network just to escape from it.
In Times Square, hundreds of people lined up in the rain to buy half-price tickets to Broadway shows. Patricia McClellan was trying to get tickets to Beauty and the Beast for her 2 school-aged children.
Trying to pick up their spirits and get them together and get them away from viewing everything that they've been looking at for the last week.
After 4 days of almost unbearable real-life drama, many wanted to see a stage story with a clear resolution, a happy ending.
The theater provides for us a little bit of release, a little bit of relief from what's going on. We can't ever forget what's gone on here in New York. It's a great tragedy, but it gives us a little bit of a mental vacation.
Those who went to New York City movie theaters seemed in search of the same thing.
It's quite ironic that I'm choosing to go to the movies for 2 hours, considering this is like being in a movie. It's surreal. It's like a Hollywood horror film, and yet I'm looking for a film to kind of just take my mind away from it,
Legions of others just wanted to stay home. Some rented half a dozen videos.
I've never rented a movie before. I just got a membership today because I plan on staying in the house all weekend. I'm not going to do anything because of the incident.
Because of that horrible incident, NFL and college football games, a usual weekend release for thousands of sports-mad New Yorkers, were canceled.
I wish I had the distraction to the release of the football season, but I understand as playing football myself, the tension of what happened at the World Trade Center, I wouldn't want to play if I was a player.
Not everyone wanted distraction. Some wanted a few hours of quiet to try to cope with the stun and the sorrow.
A lot of people died, and it broke my heart. It literally broke my heart. And I feel like crying right now.
Millions of New Yorkers still need comforting. Many said they plan to attend religious services this weekend, go to temple tonight, Mass tomorrow, or church on Sunday. The Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue has added a second service Sunday to accommodate what Senior Minister Arthur Caliandro expects will be standing room crowds.
I think what people are looking for is sanctuary, a place to be where they're safe emotionally and physically, but also that we're spiritually.
But feeling safe again seems such a long way off for most New Yorkers. So much loss still uncounted. And for most people, nothing they can do except try their best to make it through tomorrow and the next day and a long succession of days after. Beth Nissen, CNN, New York.
We want to button up a little bit of business that we've been telling you about, that the House of Representatives just a short time ago passed the use of force resolution. The Senate had passed it unanimously earlier in the day. The House, working late into this Friday evening, has now done the same, but not quite unanimously. Jonathan Karl, who covers the Congress for us, joins us now and can give us some of what happened in the House chambers. Jonathan, good evening.
Well, Aaron, the House vote, which took place just a short while ago, was 420-1. The only dissenting voice was Democrat Barbara Lee of California voting no. All other members of the House of Representatives voting yes, authorizing the president to use all necessary and appropriate force against those responsible for these attacks.
With virtually no dissent, Congress authorized the president to use all necessary and appropriate force against all those tied to the attacks.
For constitutional purposes, it's the same as a declaration of war. There is no constitutional difference between authorizing the president to use this kind of force and saying we declare war.
The hurried vote united conservatives and liberals who usually disagree about military intervention. Paul Wellstone, whose first significant vote as a senator a decade ago was against the use of force against Iraq in the Persian Gulf War, was one of the few to speak before the vote.
It's going to be a long, difficult struggle, but I believe people in our country and people in Minnesota are united in this. But we need to do this the smart way.
Despite the lack of debate, members of both parties had privately objected to a White House request for a more open-ended authorization of force against terrorists. As a result, the resolution passed authorizes the president to use military action specifically, quote, against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons.
It relates to the incident, and there's broad authority relating to the incident. It does not relate to all terrorism every place.
Several key leaders hope to avoid a repeat of the 1964 Tonkin Gulf Resolution, in which Congress, after North Vietnam allegedly attacked U.S. warships, almost unanimously granted President Johnson the authority, quote, to take all necessary measures to prevent further aggression by North Vietnam. Many in Congress came to regret that as the Vietnam War escalated and grew increasingly unpopular.
I would like to know what authority the Federal Reserve...
Now, Aaron, this may be the most widespread authorization of use of force since that Tonkin Gulf Resolution of 1964. But in the Senate, it actually took place without any formal debate whatsoever. The Senate simply went into their vote on this after passing that $40 billion emergency aid package. No vote, no dissenting voices whatsoever on this question of the use of force. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives still at work at this late hour. Right now on the floor of the House, what they're debating is, among other things, a possible aid package for the airline industry, which, of course, has been hit by not only these events, but was in financial difficulties before this even happened. Right now you see Democrat Obey, he is, of course, the top Democrat on the Appropriations Committee, talking about this. This package to aid the airline industry would be $2.5 billion in direct aid, direct cash payments to the airlines, as well as $12.5 billion in loan guarantees. The Congress, the House, hoping to get on record on this tonight before they go off for the weekend, and actually they are not coming back until Wednesday of next week, so they hope to get this done before those financial markets reopen, possibly as soon as Monday, to show that the airline industry, despite its financial dire straits, will have direct support coming from the U.S. Congress.
Jonathan, there are a number of things here to talk about. Let me just start at the end with the airline industry. You talk about direct payments, you're talking about somebody's going to write a check to American, United, Delta, and the rest, pretty much, right?
That's exactly what they're talking about. The airlines would get $2.5 billion in direct cash, and then in addition, you have those $12.5 billion in loan guarantees. And you've had two of the people that have pushed most vigorously for this have been on the Democratic side, Congressman Gephardt, the minority leader, pushing for this, but also Tom DeLay on the Republican side. Broad support for offering direct cash payments for the airline industry because they believe a special industry that has been hit, obviously, especially hard by this tragedy.
And it's not a small amount of money. Is it spread out over a period of time, or does it all go out the door at once?
Well, right now, they are trying to work on some of these details, but this is $2.5 billion in immediate cash payments, and those loan guarantees, I haven't seen the exact language, but my understanding is this is something that would all start happening immediately.
And has anyone sat down and started working a calculator to figure out what the numbers are at this point? Because I'll confess I'm a little lost here. You've got an aid package that's being worked on now, as you just mentioned, and this airline money, there's another couple billion. And you've got the talk of calling up 35,000 reservists. That's a very expensive proposition. They need to be clothed and housed and paid and the rest. Is anybody putting a number on this yet?
Well, you really are not happening. I mean, it's really not happening yet. I mean, it was amazing watching this, Aaron. I watched them as they were debating and trying to put together this aid package. And at first they were talking about numbers of about $11 billion for New York. Then all of a sudden it went to $20 billion. And then with almost the snap of your fingers, after the New York delegation met with the president and went to $40 billion in aid package, now they're calling that simply a down payment on what's going to be needed. You see this money about the bailout of the airline industry. I've talked to a number of members today as they were milling about before the vote, and they say, look, this whole question of the Social Security lockbox, that's over. We don't know how much this is going to talk. One prominent Republican predicted that the entire surplus could be blown trying to deal with the this problem. So nobody's really sat down and said, what's this going to mean? What are the costs? They're saying whatever the costs are going to be, if we need to go back into deficit spending, we'll do it. You pretty much have a consensus along party lines on that. Even some of those real budget, deficit hawks on the Republican side that are usually, so adamantly opposed to excessive government spending are saying, hey, this is a completely different situation. We have a national emergency here. There are going to be untold defense costs, untold domestic costs in terms of rebuilding the economy in New York and beyond. And they're not really talking about great concern about the deficit anymore. The thing that seemed to be such a paramount concern in Congress just 4 or 5 days ago is now really not much of a concern at all, at least in this immediate aftermath.
Yeah, remember we were talking about surpluses and the rest 4 or 5 days ago. It does seem like a long time ago. Jonathan, thank you. Jonathan Karl, working late tonight at the Capitol as the House of Representatives continues to work on the aid package and the rest. A couple images to show you before we say goodnight here from us. Back to Seattle first. This prayer vigil that has been going on now for an hour or so. And when we first took a look, it seemed to us there was a much smaller number of those votive candles being displayed. As you can see, now there is an enormous number. The Seattleites gather out in the Northwest on a Friday in September to pray, to be together, to remember those who have died in this awful week. And we rather suspect to show their support for those men and women who, as we speak, continue to work downtown in New York, down by the World Trade Center or where the Trade Center was, with their heavy machinery and on their hands and knees in some cases, sifting through the debris, looking for signs, listening carefully for any noise, a cell phone ringing, anything that would tell them there is someone there. That is one of the images of a week full of images, and we leave you tonight with a good many other images as well. Most of them, frankly, not very pretty. It has not been that kind of week. But the music underneath them is quite pretty, and that's where we'll say goodnight. We'll see you tomorrow.